This video is going to cover everything you need to know regarding JavaScript objects. We are going to talk about what objects are in JavaScript. We're going to talk about how do you create an object, how you access objects, how you add and remove properties from an object. And then we're going to talk about a few other things related to objects that are going to make them much easier to work with. So first things first, what are objects? Well, at the root of it, it is a data structure that is a key value store. You assign some value to a key, and then you can access that value within the object with that key. So when you add a value to an object, you give it a key, and then you assign that key a value. And then when you want to access that value, you just pass the object your key, and it returns the value. And the way that this will look in an object is that it will be a key colon value. So the key will be on the left side of the colon and the value will be on the right. And each key value pair is going to be separated by a comma there. So in this example here, an object is represented by these two curly braces, this left pair of curly braces and this right pair of curly braces. That represents an object, and between those curly braces are your key value pairs of your object. So as we can see here, this is the key, and then the colon points to the value in which the key kind of holds, so to speak. So here, the key, some key, points to the value of a string that represents some key. And then here we see the comma separates another key value pair here to where we have another key, colon, and then this would be another value within the overall object here. Additionally, keys must be strings in JavaScript objects. Now, this is a key difference between JavaScript objects and maps, but I'll cover maps in future videos. But keys in JavaScript must be strings, or they must be coercible to a string. So you can actually use a number as a key, but that will then be coerced into a string number and not like the data type of a number. But unlike the key needing to be a string, the value can be anything. So the key can point to an additional object, a function, a string, it can point to an array, it can point to a whole bunch of different things. There's no really requirements on that, but the key will be a string or it will be coerced to a string. And just to show you an example here, so if I say const some object is equal to this object here, and then I console log the type of some object, you'll see that these curly braces will return an object when I run this here. As you can see, I get object there because these curly braces represent an object. Now, this kind of leads me right into how to create an object within JavaScript. And there are a few different ways to do it. One way is definitely more standard than the others, but I think it's helpful to kind of know all the ways. So one way to do it is using the object constructor. So in JavaScript, you're going to have this object that is available for you for free. It's going to be in the global scope within a JavaScript runtime environment. So you're going to have this object available, and you can call this object constructor. So you can call it with a new keyword, and this will create a new object. So here, if I create my object is equal to new object, this object right here, JavaScript gives you for free this object constructor, and it will return an additional object here. So let me run this program here, and you can see that my object, it is indeed a pair of curly braces, which represents an object, and then the type of this is an object. And when you initialize this, you could also add your own object and add properties to it. So on an object, the keys are also called properties. Now, if those properties are functions, which I'll talk about in future videos, they are called methods, but right now the keys are also called properties. Now here, I can add a property to this. My name is Ryan, and if we run this here, you can see that this object is initialized with the property of my name, or the key of my name with the value of Ryan. Now, the more standard way to create objects is actually just to use curly braces, and this is called an object literal. So here, I don't call new object, I just open up a pair of curly braces here, and then I don't need to initialize this with any values, but here I use the key YouTube channel and I assign it to the value of code Ryan. And what you can see here, if I run this, you're going to see that this is indeed an object, and it is initialized with YouTube channel, with the key of YouTube channel pointing to the value of code Ryan. So here you can create an object by just opening up a pair of curly braces like so, and you don't need to initialize this with any values here. This is still going to be an object. This is just initializing this to an empty object here. So this is the more standard way of doing things. And then you can see here, it is initialized to an empty pair of curly braces and it's still an object. So this is the more standard way to do things. There's not necessarily anything wrong with doing it the other way, but this way is kind of what is accepted as the standard way and is what you'll see probably most often in your programs. Now you can also use the object.create method. So just like we called new object with this built-in object that JavaScript gives us, we can also access a method on that object called create. And this will create a new object. Now, this one's a little bit different in which you need to pass it a initial object. And the reason you need to do this, I'm not going to get too in-depth of object prototypes and inheritance in this video. I will cover those in more videos. This is more so just an overview of kind of the fundamentals of objects within JavaScript. But when you use the object.create method, it does return a new object. However, the object it returns, it will effectively inherit from whatever object you pass in here. So this object that you pass in is thought of as the prototype object. And the object that is returned, it is going to be linked to your prototype object. So whatever object you pass in here, you are on your new object, you're going to have all the properties and methods available on this object that you pass in. So if I run this here, and if I also run type of this object here, you're going to see that I get the same result. I still get an empty object here and I get the object. And then when I initialize this with a default value, you're going to see some interesting behavior. So when I actually console log this object, it's not actually going to show this property on this object. That's because this is the prototype object. The new object that it returns is effectively just inheriting the properties and methods of this object you pass in, but it isn't going to hold those properties and methods in this object itself. So if I run this, you see that I get an empty object in an object, but you see in my object here, you can't see the property YouTube channel pointing to the value of code Ryan. However, if I try to access code Ryan on my object, what JavaScript is going to do here, or if I try to access the key of YouTube channel on this and console it out, what JavaScript's going to do here is it's not going to see YouTube channel specifically on this my object, but it's going to look up the prototype chain. And I'll cover this in future videos, but it's going to say, okay, I don't have it on this object, but do I inherit from any objects that have the property of YouTube channel? And it does. So what I would expect to see here is it console logs out Ryan, because it does inherit the property of YouTube channel, because this is the prototype object in which this new object here will inherit from. But this won't specifically hold these properties. And if I had methods on here, it would work the same way. It won't hold these on this specific instance of the new object that's returned from object.create, but it will inherit those properties, which is why I can still access all those properties here. Okay, it's a little bit tricky, which is why this is probably also not a standard way of doing things, but it is still helpful to know about. Okay, so I would say those are kind of the three main ways to create new objects in JavaScript. And the kind of most standard way is just assigning some variable to a pair of curly braces and then working with it from there. Now, how do you access an object? And I might have shown it a little bit here throughout this video already, but one common way of doing things is using dot notation. And you might have saw this in my examples before, but to explain it a little bit further here. So I create a new object called my object, and I give it the property YouTube channel with the value of code Ryan. And then I give it another property of my name with the value of Ryan Solomon. And here, using dot notation, so I use my variable name, the label of this object here that I assigned it to, and then I can access these properties with dot and then the key value. So to access a key on an object, you can use a dot and then the name of the key. So here I'm accessing the YouTube channel property, and here I'm accessing the my name property. And as you can see, that gives me the values that are assigned to those keys or assigned to those properties of this object here. So one way to access values on an object is passing in the key of that value. Now, if I pass in a key that doesn't exist, so the key of undefined does not exist, and what this will actually return is indeed undefined. It doesn't throw an error, but it does return undefined. If I try to access a key that doesn't exist on an object, I get the value of undefined. And you'll often get an error in JavaScript called cannot read properties of undefined or cannot access properties of undefined. And this will commonly occur when you try to access a key on an object that doesn't exist. So look out for that error. If you run into it, you're just like every other JavaScript programmer in the history of JavaScript programmers, so do not feel bad about yourself. Okay, but that is using dot notation. And I would say this is probably the most standard way of doing things, but you can also use bracket notation. And I believe this is the same way in Python. I think that you access things in bracket notation. I could be wrong there, but I have written a little bit of Python in my day, and I believe that's how it's done. But as we can see here, and for now, I want to kind of ignore this line for now. I will talk about that in just 1 second here. But if we just look at line 53 here, you see I declare an object and I assign it to the same object I had before with the properties of YouTube channel and my Ryan pointing to their corresponding values there. Now here I can access them the same way, but using bracket notation. So instead of using a dot here, I use a left bracket, and then between my brackets, so between my left and right bracket here, I pass in a string that represents the key I want to access. Because although I don't need to wrap this value in strings here for it to be valid, you don't need to do that with JavaScript objects. It already kind of knows that that is going to be a string anyway, so it does it for you. So I don't need to do this specifically there. But like I said earlier, all properties on objects in JavaScript are going to be strings. So when you access with bracket notation, you do need to pass a string, which is different from dot notation. With dot notation, it will automatically use a string value for whatever you try to access with a dot. But with brackets, you must pass a string here. Okay, so if I run this, and I'll show you the reason why in just a second here, but if I run this, you can see that I get the same values as I did before with the dot notation. And one reason why you need to do this here is sometimes you want to access an object using a variable that is a key. So here I have a constant sum variable, and it's the value of YouTube channel, which as you can see here is the same value of the key that I have right here. So I have some variable is equal to YouTube channel, and that is the same value of one of my keys. So what if I want to access this YouTube channel key on this object using this variable? Well, here you have to use bracket notation. You cannot use dot notation with a variable to access a key in an object. So here on the bottom line, let me get rid of those. On the bottom line, I do my object, bracket, and then I pass in some variable without the quotes around it. So here, JavaScript's going to look for a variable. It's not going to look for a key that's a string, some variable. It's going to look for the variable in your program called some variable, and that's going to evaluate to the string of YouTube channel, which is going to give me the value of Code Ryan. But here you can see that, say I just tried to pass my name, not as a string. Well, JavaScript's going to look for the variable my name, but it's not going to find it anywhere. So here I'm going to get an error. My name is not defined. I do not have a variable in my program called my name, so I get an error there. So when using bracket notation, you must wrap your key in quotes in a string, or if you need to access an object using a variable, then you don't wrap it in a string, you just pass in the variable, but you must do this with bracket notation. If I try to do dot some variable, it's going to try to access the string of some variable, and I will indeed get undefined here. As you can see, I get undefined because the string some variable is not a key in my object. So that is how you access an object using dot or bracket notation. I would probably default to using dot notation unless you need to access an object using a variable or something like that. Now, adding and removing values from an object. So you can see that you can, when you create an object, you can assign it like default values right away. So I initialize this object with a property called default value, and I give it the value of default. However, I can use dot notation. I could also use bracket notation to do the same thing here. Here I just decided to use dot notation. I would say this is more of a standard way of doing this, but I do some object dot YouTube channel. So this is me creating the property YouTube channel and assigning it to the value of Code Ryan. It's just how you would create like any other variable in your program, but here I'm just accessing my object. I'm giving it the property of YouTube channel and then assigning it the value of Code Ryan. And here I'm doing the same thing. I'm assigning it a dot name property and assigning it the value of Ryan Solomon. So here, if I log this out, you can see that I get an object that has my default value, and then it has my YouTube channel property and my name property as well. And then just to show you that the same thing would work here if I used bracket notation, and then as you can see, I get the same result there. So you can use either dot or bracket notation to create new properties on an object, but I would say the more standard way is using dot notation. Now for removing values of an object, you can use the delete keyword. So here I call delete some object dot name. So this is telling JavaScript that I want to delete the name property of this object. And if I run this here, you can see that my object no longer has the property of name because I deleted it here. So delete is a keyword in JavaScript in which you could delete values. And here you can delete the value of an object using delete some object dot name. Now there's other ways that you could potentially do this, of course, but I find just for basic adding and removing values from an object, these ways make a lot of sense to do. Okay. Now I want to move on to a couple other nuances of objects that are going to be very helpful to know when working with objects. So what if you add the same key twice to an object? Do you run into like a collision that triggers a massive error in your program? You actually don't. And what you actually do is you overwrite the property of that object. So here I'm creating a new object called my object, and I'm assigning it to an object literal here. And like I went over earlier, I could technically use the new object constructor and get the same result here. And also I could use object.create if I really wanted to. But here I use the object literal. I assign it a property of name and a value of Ryan. And then here I assign it a property of YouTube channel and I give it the value of Code James. And then on the next line here, I do the same thing. I access the property YouTube channel and assign it the value of Code Ryan. Now, since JavaScript is a single threaded synchronous language, although it can allow you to do asynchronous things. By default, it's going to be a single-threaded synchronous language in which it goes through your code just line by line. So at first we'll execute this and create your new object, and then it will add YouTube channel as a property to that object with code James. And then here it's going to access the property YouTube channel and assign it the value of code Ryan. So it assigns it a brand new value here. So based on what I just discussed there, what would you expect to happen here when I cancel out my object? Well, hopefully if I didn't do a terrible job explaining things there, you would expect the YouTube channel property now to have the value of code Ryan as you can see here, it does. Because as my program goes here, I'm just reassigning the property YouTube channel to the value of code Ryan. So if you add the same key twice to an object, whatever you add last is going to be the value of that key. Because JavaScript's going to go line by line through your code. And here I'm just reassigning my key YouTube channel to the value of code Ryan. So whatever you add last is going to end up being the value of that object, which this could be helpful when you do things like object spread, which I'm going to take a entirely different video to explain the spread operator and that sort of thing for objects and arrays. But just know that information can come in handy when using different tools like that within the language. Now, what if you want to use, so I talked earlier about using a variable to access a key, but what if you want the variable to be the key? Well, it's very similar to before. You must use bracket notation, and you will pass in the variable without any quotes. So here on line 83, I declare a new empty object. On line 81, I have the variable my name and I assign it to the value of Ryan. And then on line 85 here, I use bracket notation. I pass in my variable my name and I assign it to the value of this is my name. Now, be careful here. What do you think the key is going to be here? Well, JavaScript is going to see, okay, we passed in a variable called my name that does exist in our program. What value is this variable going to evaluate to? Well, it's actually going to be the string of my name. So my object here is going to have a property called Ryan, and I'm going to assign it the value of that is my name. So here, I'm not assigning my object the property of my name. I'm assigning it the value of this variable, which is Ryan. And let me just console log out the object. You're going to see that I have one property, which is Ryan, which is the value of this variable, and that it is assigned the value of that is my name. Okay, so you can use variables as keys. Just know that that is going to be assigned the value of the variable as your key and not the name of the variable. One cool thing that you can do within JavaScript is if you want to set the variable as the key and you want the value of that key to be the same as the value of the variable, which is actually a pretty common thing to do within JavaScript, setting the key the same name as your value. Well, JavaScript actually allows you to use Object Shorthand to do this in a very easy way. So here I define a constant called Ryan and I assign it to the value of Ryan. And I declare two different objects. These are two completely different objects. For my first object, I give it a property of Ryan, and then I assign it to the value of Ryan. Now, notice here, since I don't use bracket notation here, I am not accessing this variable. I am basically just doing this. I am just effectively hard coding the string Ryan here and giving it the value of Ryan. Now, if I wanted to declare this with the variable here, all I would do is use square brackets. So here, this now accesses the variable Ryan. So you can see when I hover over it here, it says const Ryan is equal to Ryan because it's accessing this variable right here. However, when I don't use square brackets here, it's just going to give me the property Ryan, and it's a string. So that is the same thing as just doing this here. Okay, so if you want to declare an object and you want a variable to be a key in that initial like declaration, you do the same thing that we did up here, but right in your property, you pass in the square brackets here. And this will access this variable here. And it assigns it to the value of Ryan. Okay. So if I remove that there, and I technically wouldn't need to remove that, I get the same result. But here in object 2, I only pass it the name of Ryan. And JavaScript will automatically make a key here called Ryan and assign it to the value of the Ryan variable. So these two are actually going to be equivalent. This is called object shorthand right here. This will automatically create a key that is assigned to this variable here called Ryan, and it will give it the value of Ryan. And if I log these out here, you can see that I get the very same object in both instances. So in your program, if you have some variable that exists and you want to add that variable to an object in which the name of that variable is the key and the value of that variable is the value of that object, then you can just pass in the variable here. And this doesn't have to be Ryan. I can change this to Ryan Solomon and still run this here. And you can see that both of these still will give it the key of Ryan, and it will evaluate to Ryan Solomon. So here it will access the label and it will automatically create a key with that label and assign it to the value of this variable. And this does the same thing, except I just hard code Ryan as the property and then give it the value of this variable here. Now, if I wrap this in brackets here, this is going to actually access the value contained in this Ryan variable. So this is actually going to assign this key the value of Ryan Solomon, and it's going to point to the variable or the value held in this variable, which is Ryan Solomon. So you can see that when I run this, I get the key of Ryan Solomon points to Ryan Solomon, because when I put square brackets around the property, it's going to evaluate to the value of this variable. It's not just going to assign it the string Ryan like it does here. Okay, but just for further illustration, you can see how if I have a bunch of variables in my program and I want to add those all to an object, it's much easier to do this, in which I just add a comma separated list of my variable names, and this will automatically create a key called Ryan pointing to Ryan Solomon and a key called YouTube channel pointing to code Ryan. And if I wanted to do the same thing in this object, I would actually have to write it out the long way. I would do YouTube channel : is equal to the variable of YouTube channel. And you can see this just gets kind of redundant to do. And this is a nice kind of shorthand way of doing it, but I will get the same result here, as you can see. But JavaScript shorthand properties are something that's very kind of useful to do. It's standard. You'll see this a lot. It can look weird if you don't know what's going on here, because we're not like assigning this a value here at all. But JavaScript, if you have a variable in your program and you just pass that variable to an object, it will automatically give the key, the name, or the label of that variable and assign it to the value of that variable. Okay. So hopefully that's clear. That can be a little bit tricky at first to kind of wrap your head around, but with a little bit of practice there, you'll see it a bunch in your program, so you will get used to it. Now, The final thing on objects I want to cover in this video is that objects are passed by reference. So effectively what that means is that when you assign a label to an object, it's just going to assign basically a pointer to that object. And that is called passing by reference. You're just passing around a reference to that object or a pointer to that object. You're not passing the entire value itself. So with primitive values within JavaScript, you are passing those by value, meaning when you assign a string or a primitive value to a label, you are assigning that value to that label. You're not just assigning a reference to that value. Okay? But with objects, with a non-primitive data structure, and it works with arrays too, which in JavaScript, the type of arrays is an object, so it works the same way. But here, I'm on line 103, I'm saying object 1 is pointing to this object literal with a property YouTube channel and a value of code Ryan. And then here on line 104, I say object 2, so a new label, and then I say it is equal to object 1. So what's actually going on here is both of these labels are pointing to the same object. So object 1 is pointing to YouTube channel, which is code Ryan, this object here. And then object 2, well, that's pointing to object 1, which is pointing to this object here. So both of these variables here are actually pointing to the same object. So here, when I say object2.YouTube channel is equal to code whatever, so I overwrite the YouTube channel property and assign it a new value, what do you think is going to happen here when I console log object 1 and object 2? Well, since they're pointing to the same value under the hood here, and since objects are passed by reference, and same thing with arrays, this is not true for primitive values in JavaScript, but for objects and arrays, since they're passed by reference, both of these are going to point to the same object here. And you're going to actually see that on both objects, this is going to change the property YouTube channel. Since these both point to the same exact object, when I change a property on either of these objects, it's going to change for both of these labels that you use because both labels are pointing to the same object. So if I do object1.name is equal to Ryan, you're going to see that this adds a property of name to both objects here. And it does, because since objects are passed by reference, if you assign labels to the same object, it's going to point to the exact same object in memory. It is not going to be two different objects here. So in future videos, we're going to cover iterating over objects, using methods on objects or functions on objects, using the built-in object and the methods that come with that. We'll talk classes. We'll cover a whole lot more. But with objects, objects are a key value stored in which the key is going to be a string and the value can be any data type. And the key is going to be the left side of the colon, the value to the right. And each key value pair within an object is going to be separated by a comma, and an object in JavaScript is represented by curly braces. You can create an object using the new Object Constructor. You can use the object literal, which is just an opening up a pair of curly braces that automatically creates an object. And you can also use object.create and pass it a prototype object. Additionally, you can access an object using dot notation or bracket notation. With bracket notation, you must wrap your key in a string, or you can also pass it a variable using bracket notation. And that is probably one of the best use cases for bracket notation, is when you want to access a value using a variable as your key. You can add and remove values from an object using the bracket or dot notation and just assigning it to a value like you would kind of create any other variable within your program. And then you can use the delete keyword to delete a property of that object. Additionally, if you use the same key twice on an object, whatever key you add to that object last is going to represent the value for that object. If you want to use a variable as a key, you must use bracket notation. And then you can also use object shorthand, in which if you have a variable in your program, You can add that very easily to an object by just passing the variable to that object, and JavaScript will automatically give that object a key with the label of that variable and then assign it to the value of that variable. So here, the key Ryan is going to be assigned to the value of Ryan Solomon. And then keep in mind that objects are passed by reference. So if you have two labels in your program pointing to the same object, whenever you change anything on one label, it's going to change everything for that other label because they will point to the same value under the hood in memory in JavaScript. So I hope you learned something from this, and I will catch you in that next one.